At the top of a luxurious building, a millionaire hears a cutting plea that echoes from the square. "God, I beg you, and I haven't eaten for days." Curious and shaken, he goes down and finds a fragile girl on her knees whose faith contrasts with the hunger she tries to hide. Upon discovering who the child's grandmother is, forgotten memories drag him back to a past of humility and gratitude. Without knowing it, that prayer sealed the destiny of two hungry souls, one for bread, the other for redemption. The December rain fell relentlessly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Harrison Tower in downtown Boston. Richard Harrison stood in his corner office on the 30th floor, watching droplets race down the glass, while the city lights blurred beneath the gray afternoon sky. At 58, he had built a real estate empire that dominated the Boston skyline, his name emblazoned on luxury hotels and office buildings throughout New England. Richard adjusted his perfectly tailored suit and checked his Patek Philippe watch. 6:15 p.m. Another 14-hour workday nearly complete. His assistant had left hours ago, along with the rest of his executive team. The solitude suited him fine, it always had, especially over the past decade. The office was meticulously organized. Much like Richard himself, contemporary art worth millions adorned the walls, investments, not passions. The only personal touch was a small, faded photograph tucked away in his desk drawer, one he hadn't looked at in years. He returned to his mahogany desk, where spreadsheets displayed the Harrison Group's latest acquisition plans. Numbers had always made sense to Richard. They were reliable, predictable, unlike people. His reputation in business circles was legendary, brilliant but cold, successful but isolated, generous with charities but impossible to reach emotionally. As Richard typed final notes on his keyboard, a sound caught his attention, faint but distinct, carried up from the small park across the street. He paused, tilting his head slightly. The rain had eased momentarily, and through the partially open window, a child's voice drifted upward. "Please, God, I'm begging you. It's been days since I've had a proper meal. And Grandma needs help too." The voice was small but determined, a girl's voice trembling slightly from cold or emotion, perhaps both. Richard found himself moving toward the window, drawn by the raw sincerity in that prayer. From his elevated vantage point, he could see a small figure sitting alone on a bench in Franklin Square. Even from this distance, he could tell she was young, maybe 10 or 11, wearing a coat too thin for the December chill. Her head was bowed, hands clasped tightly around something small he couldn't identify. "I'm not asking for myself," the voice continued, carried upward on the winter wind. "But Grandma's medicine cost so much, and I promised I'd take care of her." Richard felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. He had mastered the art of emotional detachment years ago, after the accident that took his wife Sarah and their unborn child. That had been the turning point, the moment when Richard Harrison decided that vulnerability was a weakness he couldn't afford. He had thrown himself into work, building his company into an empire, surrounding himself with the protective armor of wealth and success. Yet something about this child's prayer pierced through that armor, reaching a part of him he thought long dormant. Before he could analyze his actions, Richard found himself shutting his laptop, grabbing his overcoat, and heading for the elevator. The security guard in the lobby looked surprised to see him leaving at this hour. "Heading out early, Mr. Harrison." Richard nodded curtly, pulling on his gloves as he stepped outside into the cold. The rain had started again, softer now but persistent. He crossed the street toward Franklin Square, his Italian leather shoes splashing through puddles he would normally avoid. The girl remained on the bench, her small figure hunched against the weather. As Richard approached, he could see her more clearly. Honey blonde hair in a neat but slightly damp ponytail, clothes worn but clean, and in her hands a small wooden cross she was gripping as if it were a lifeline. Richard slowed his pace, suddenly uncertain. He wasn't accustomed to spontaneous actions or interactions with strangers, particularly children. What exactly was he planning to do? What could he say? Before he could retreat, the girl looked up, noticing his presence. Her eyes widened slightly, striking blue eyes that seemed too wise for her young face. She quickly wiped away a tear with the back of her hand, straightening her posture as if determined to maintain dignity. "Hello?" Richard said, his business voice automatically softening. "Hello, sir," she replied, her tone respectful but not fearful. There was a quiet strength in her demeanor that surprised him. Richard gestured to the bench. "May I sit?" The girl nodded, moving slightly to make room. Up close, Richard could see the careful darning on her coat sleeves and the scuffed but polished shoes. Someone had taught this child to take pride in appearance despite limited resources. "My name is Richard," he said, deliberately omitting his last name. His reputation in Boston was considerable. The Harrison name would immediately create a barrier. "I'm Lily Bennett," she replied, tucking the wooden cross into her coat pocket. "Are you waiting for someone too?" "No," Richard answered, unsure how to continue. Direct questions seemed best. "I couldn't help overhearing. Are you hungry, Lily?" The girl's cheeks flushed slightly, but her gaze remained steady. "I'm fine, sir." "Richard," he corrected gently, "and I think you're being brave, not honest." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "My grandma says those are often the same thing. Your grandmother sounds wise." "She is." Pride filled Lily's voice. "She taught second grade for 40 years before she got sick. Now I help take care of her." Richard noted the present tense. So the grandmother was still alive, though ill. "And your parents?" "My dad's a doctor. He's working at a clinic in Guatemala. He sends money when he can, but..." She shrugged, a gesture too adult for her young shoulders. "Communication isn't always reliable, and Grandma's medicine is expensive." Richard found himself intrigued by this child's mature handling of clearly difficult circumstances. "So it's just you and your grandmother?" Lily nodded. "We live in the apartment behind St. Mary's Church. Father Wilson lets us stay there in exchange for helping around the church. I clean the pews and arrange the flowers when there are any." Richard felt an unexpected jolt at the mention of Father Wilson. Could it be the same Wilson? He pushed the thought aside for now. "Have you had dinner, Lily?" he asked. "I'll have something when I get home," she answered evasively. Richard stood, making a decision. "There's a diner across the street. I was about to have dinner there myself. Would you join me?" Lily hesitated, studying him with those discerning blue eyes. "My grandma says I shouldn't accept things from strangers." "Wise advice," Richard agreed. "But I'm not offering charity, Lily. I'm offering company at dinner. There's a difference." "And what do you want in return?" she asked bluntly. The question startled a genuine laugh from Richard, something that hadn't happened in longer than he could remember. "Conversation, I suppose. You seem like an interesting person to talk to." Lily considered this, then stood, straightening her coat. "I can pay for my own meal," she stated firmly, reaching into her pocket and producing a few crumpled dollar bills. "I earned this helping Mrs. Abernathy with her groceries." Richard felt something twist in his chest again. Respect, perhaps, for this child's dignity in the face of obvious need. "I have no doubt you did," he said. "But as I said, I'm inviting you as my guest." After another moment's consideration, Lily nodded. "All right, but I'll help you with something in return. That's only fair." As they walked towards Sullivan's diner, the rain easing to a light drizzle, Richard realized he had just experienced something he couldn't explain. An impulsive act of kindness with no strategic value or business purpose. For a man whose every action was typically calculated for maximum return, this deviation from pattern was as puzzling as it was unprecedented. What Richard couldn't know then was that this simple dinner invitation would set in motion events that would transform not only his life, but the lives of everyone connected to this remarkable child. Sullivan's Diner stood as a testament to old Boston, with its red vinyl booths and black and white checkerboard floor. The neon sign in the window cast a warm glow against the darkening winter evening. Inside, the smell of coffee and homemade pie created an atmosphere of comfort that felt foreign to Richard's typical dining experiences at exclusive restaurants. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Betty according to her name tag, greeted Lily with familiar warmth. "Hey there, sunshine. Haven't seen you in a while." She glanced curiously at Richard, but didn't comment on the unlikely pair they made. The girl in her worn coat and the executive in his $1,000 suit. "Hi, Betty," Lily replied with a smile that transformed her solemn face. "This is my friend Richard." Friend. The word caught Richard off guard. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had used that term to describe him. They settled into a corner booth, and Betty brought menus along with a glass of water for each of them. Richard noticed how Lily studied the prices first, her brow furrowing slightly. "Order whatever you'd like," he said quietly. Lily looked up. The grilled cheese is very good here. Is that what you want or what you think is reasonable to order? Those wise blue eyes met his again, evaluating. Both, she finally answered with a hint of a smile. When Betty returned, Lily ordered the grilled cheese with tomato soup, while Richard requested a club sandwich. As the waitress departed, a comfortable silence settled between them, surprising Richard. He was accustomed to the awkward pauses that often punctuated his rare social interactions, the result of his reputation and deliberate emotional distance. "So," Richard began, "you mentioned you live behind St. Mary's with your grandmother. How long have you been there?" "Almost 2 years now," Lily replied, carefully arranging her napkin in her lap. "After Grandma got sick, we couldn't afford our apartment anymore. Father Wilson knew us from church and offered the caretaker's apartment." "And your father has been in Guatemala all this time?" Lily nodded. "He went for a 6-month mission trip with Doctors Without Borders, but they needed him to stay longer. He helps children in remote villages." Pride colored her voice again. "He says he'll come home when his work there is finished." Richard considered the complexity of this child's situation, a father working abroad, a sick grandmother, living essentially on charity. Yet there was no self-pity in her demeanor, only a practical acceptance. "What about school?" he asked. "I go to St. Mary's Elementary. The church covers my tuition." She brightened. "I really like science and math. My teacher says I could get a scholarship for high school if I keep my grades up." Their food arrived, and Richard watched as Lily carefully unfolded her napkin and placed it in her lap before taking her first bite. Despite her obvious hunger, she ate with deliberate manners. Someone had raised this child with care. "This is wonderful," she said, after savoring her first spoonful of soup. "Thank you, Richard." "You're welcome." He found himself strangely touched by her simple gratitude. "Tell me more about your grandmother." Lily's face softened. "Grandma Martha is the smartest, kindest person I know. She taught 2nd grade at Woodrow Wilson Elementary for 40 years. Everyone in the neighborhood knows her. She used to bake cookies for all her students at Christmas." The name sparked a memory in Richard's mind. "Martha, what's your grandmother's full name?" "Martha Bennett," Lily answered, dipping her grilled cheese into the soup. Richard felt the world tilt slightly. Martha Bennett. The coincidence seemed impossible, yet somehow inevitable. Did your grandmother ever work anywhere besides the school? Perhaps a summer job? Lily thought for a moment. She did mention working as a secretary when she was younger, before she became a teacher. "I think it was at a real estate office downtown." "Harrison Properties," Richard said quietly. Lily's eyes widened. "How did you know that?" "Because I was there. Martha Bennett was my first employee when I started my company 30 years ago." Richard's mind raced through memories long buried. "She worked for me for 2 summers while completing her teaching degree. She was kind to me, at a time when kindness was rare in my life." "Wait," Lily put down her spoon, studying him more intently. "Are you Richard Harrison?" "The Richard Harrison?" He nodded, watching her expression carefully. "Grandma has a photo of you. It's in her memory box. She always said you were the smartest young man she ever met, and that you would build something important someday." Lily's expression was a mixture of awe and delight. "She'll be so excited when I tell her I met you." Richard felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. He had employed thousands of people over the years, yet couldn't remember the last time he'd heard he had made a positive impression on anyone. The business world knew him as ruthless and brilliant, not kind or memorable in any personal way. "Your grandmother remembered me all these years?" "Of course," Lily said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Grandma says good people leave fingerprints on your heart." The sentiment was so unexpected, so contrary to Richard's carefully constructed worldview, that he found himself momentarily speechless. In his experience, people remembered you for what you could give them, or how you had wronged them, not for moments of ordinary human connection. "I'd like to see your grandmother, if that would be all right," he said finally. Lily hesitated. "She's not feeling very well these days. The medicine makes her tired." "What's wrong with her, if you don't mind my asking?" "She has something with her heart. Cardiomyopathy, the doctor called it." Lily pronounced the difficult word with careful precision. "She needs special medicine and regular checkups, but the insurance doesn't cover everything." Richard made a mental note to look into this condition. If Martha Bennett had indeed been his first employee, He felt a responsibility that transcended the chance encounter with her granddaughter. As they finished their meal, Richard found himself sharing small details about his business and daily life, drawn out by Lily's genuine curiosity and intelligent questions. She listened with complete attention, a skill many adults lacked. When Betty brought the check, Lily excused herself to use the restroom. The waitress lingered, giving Richard a measuring look. "That's a special kid," she said, nodding toward where Lily had disappeared. "Comes in here sometimes with the church ladies after Sunday service. Always insists on leaving whatever change she has as a tip, even when it's just pennies." Betty's expression softened. Her grandma raised her right even with all they've been through. Richard nodded, leaving a generous tip as he paid the bill. Yes, she certainly did. Outside, the rain had stopped, though the January air remained bitterly cold. Richard insisted on driving Lily home, calling his car service. While they waited, she looked up at the Harrison Tower looming above them. "Is your office at the very top?" she asked. "Yes, the 30th floor. You can see all of Boston from there." "It must be like being a bird," Lily mused. "Seeing everything from above." "I suppose it is," Richard agreed, realizing he had never thought of it that way, though sometimes I wonder if I miss things by being so far removed. The sleek black car arrived, and Richard saw Lily's eyes widen at the luxury vehicle. As they settled into the back seat, he gave the driver the address for St. Mary's Church. "This is the fanciest car I've ever been in," Lily whispered, running her hand over the leather seat. "It's just a car," Richard said, suddenly uncomfortable with the display of wealth in contrast to Lily's circumstances. "No," she corrected him gently. "It's a beautiful car. It's okay to appreciate beautiful things, Grandma says, as long as you remember they're just things." Again, Richard found himself struck by the wisdom in her words. Throughout his career, he had accumulated possessions as markers of success, but rarely stopped to truly appreciate them. As they approached the church, Lily pointed to a small stone building behind the main structure. "That's where we live. The caretaker's cottage." Richard noted the modest but well-maintained building, ivy climbing its walls despite the winter season. St. Mary's itself was an impressive Gothic structure, its stained glass windows glowing warmly in the evening darkness. "Thank you for dinner," Lily said as the car stopped. "And for the ride home." "It was my pleasure," Richard replied, and was surprised to realize he meant it sincerely. "May I walk you to your door? I'd like to say hello to your grandmother, if she's up for visitors." Lily considered this, then nodded. "I think she'd like that, even if just for a minute. She has good days and bad days." As they approached the cottage, Richard noticed a figure watching from the window, an elderly woman, her silhouette framed by soft light from within. He felt an unexpected nervousness, like a student about to meet a respected teacher after many years. What he couldn't anticipate was how this reunion would unlock memories long buried, or how it would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he believed about success, connection, and the walls he had built around his heart. The caretaker's cottage behind St. Mary's Church was small but immaculately kept. As Lily opened the door, the aroma of herbal tea and old books greeted them, a stark contrast to the sterile, expensive fragrance of Richard's penthouse apartment. "Grandma, I'm home," Lily called softly, "and I've brought someone special to see you." Martha Bennett sat in a worn armchair near a small electric fireplace, a crocheted blanket covering her legs. At 78, her face carried the gentle map of years in fine lines around her eyes and mouth, but her posture remained straight, maintaining the dignity Richard vaguely remembered from 3 decades earlier. When her eyes met his, recognition bloomed immediately. "Richard Harrison," she said, her voice warm with surprise. "After all these years." "Hello, Mrs. Bennett," Richard replied, suddenly feeling like the awkward 25-year-old who had hired her for his fledgling company rather than the corporate titan he had become. "It's just Martha now, Richard. We're well past formalities at our age." She gestured to a chair across from her. "Please sit. Lily, would you make us some tea, dear?" As Lily bustled about in the tiny kitchen alcove, Martha studied Richard with clear, intelligent eyes that reminded him of her granddaughters. "You've done well for yourself. I see your buildings all over the city." "Yes," Richard answered, unsure why her simple observation made him feel both proud and slightly embarrassed. "The company has grown considerably." "And you? Have you grown considerably too?" The question was asked without judgment, just genuine curiosity. Before Richard could formulate a response, Lily returned with 3 mismatched teacups on a tray. "Grandma, Richard took me to dinner at Sullivan's and he told me you used to work for him." Martha smiled, accepting the tea. "I did indeed. 2 summers while finishing my teaching degree. Richard was just starting out then, working harder than anyone I'd ever met." She turned to him. "You were determined to succeed even then. I remember you encouraging me when my first loan application was rejected," Richard said, memories surfacing unexpectedly. "You said persistence would outweigh rejection every time. You remembered that?" Martha seemed pleased. It's always strange to discover which words stick with people through the years. As they sipped tea, Richard observed the comfortable routine between grandmother and granddaughter, the gentle way Lily adjusted Martha's blanket, the knowing glances they exchanged. Despite their modest surroundings, there was a wealth of affection here that made his own luxurious apartment seem suddenly barren in comparison. "Lily tells me you've been unwell," Richard said finally. Martha waved a dismissive hand. "The heart doesn't work quite as it should anymore, but I've had 78 good years with it, so I can hardly complain." "Grandma," Lily said with the exasperation of someone who had this conversation often, "the doctor said you need to take it seriously." Richard watched the exchange, noting the concern in Lily's young face. "Is there anything I can do to help?" he found himself asking. "That's very kind," Martha replied, "but we manage well enough. Father Wilson has been a blessing and the church community supports us." Richard felt a familiar tension at the mention of Wilson again. "Father Wilson? Would that be Thomas Wilson?" Martha nodded. "Yes, do you know him?" "I knew his brother James. We were business partners briefly." Richard kept his tone neutral, though the memory of James Wilson's betrayal still rankled after all these years. "Ah," Martha said, understanding passing across her face. "Yes, I recall something about that. The brothers are quite different men, I assure you." The conversation shifted to lighter topics: Martha's teaching career, Lily's schoolwork, changes in Boston over the decades. Richard found himself more engaged than he had been in any social interaction in years. There was something refreshing about conversation, with no business agenda, no underlying negotiations. As the evening drew on, Richard noticed Martha's energy waning, though she tried to hide her fatigue. When she stifled a yawn behind her hand, he rose to leave. "I've imposed on your evening long enough," he said. "Thank you for the tea and conversation." "It was lovely to see you again, Richard," Martha replied. "Life has a curious way of bringing people back into our paths when we least expect it." At the door, Lily looked up at him earnestly. "Will you come back sometime?" The question caught Richard off guard. His carefully structured life rarely included social visits or developing new relationships. Yet he found himself answering, "I'd like that, if it's all right with your grandmother." "She'd like that too," Lily said confidently. "She doesn't have many visitors who remember her from before." Richard hesitated, then reached into his wallet and handed Lily his business card. "If you or your grandmother need anything, please call. Day or night." Lily accepted the card carefully, as if it were something precious. "Thank you for dinner, Richard, and for bringing me home." As his car pulled away from St. Mary's, Richard found himself looking back at the small cottage, its windows glowing warmly against the cold January night. Something had shifted in his carefully ordered world, though he couldn't yet define what it was. The following morning, Richard arrived at his office earlier than usual. The encounter with Martha and Lily Bennett lingered in his thoughts, disrupting his typical focus. He found himself opening his computer and typing cardiomyopathy treatments into the search engine. An hour later, his assistant Jennifer entered, surprised to find him already deep in research. "Mr. Harrison, I wasn't expecting you until 9. Your first meeting isn't until—" "Cancel my meetings today," Richard interrupted, making a decision. "And get me Dr. Lawrence Stevenson at Boston Memorial." Jennifer blinked in surprise but nodded. "Right away, sir." Dr. Stevenson was Boston's leading cardiologist and had been a beneficiary of Richard's philanthropy for years. The call was brief and to the point. By noon, Richard had arranged for Martha Bennett to receive a full cardiac evaluation at Boston Memorial's top facility, with all expenses covered by the Harrison Foundation. What Richard hadn't anticipated was the response when he called the cottage to inform Martha of the appointment. "That's extremely generous, Richard. Martha said, her voice firm despite the phone's slight static. "But I can't accept charity, even from an old friend." "It's not charity," Richard argued, unused to having his offers rejected. "It's a proper use of the Foundation's medical outreach program." "Even so," Martha replied gently, "I've taught Lily that we make our own way in this world. Accepting help is one thing, depending on it is another." Richard found himself frustrated, yet oddly respectful of her stance. "Then consider it a loan, to be repaid when you're able." A soft chuckle came through the line. "At my age, that's a risky investment strategy, Richard." "I've built my fortune on calculated risks," he countered. After a thoughtful pause, Martha proposed an unexpected compromise. "Lily mentioned you have extensive gardens at your corporate properties. She's quite good with plants, inherited my green thumb. Perhaps she could tend to some of your office greenery in exchange for the medical care." Richard considered the proposal. It was unorthodox, but it offered Martha the dignity she clearly valued while allowing him to help. "We do have extensive interior landscaping that requires maintenance. I'm sure we could arrange something suitable." And so began an unusual arrangement. 3 afternoons a week after school, Lily would come to the Harrison Tower to tend the numerous plants throughout the building's lobby and offices. Richard instructed his assistant to pay her a wage commensurate with professional landscaping services, ensuring it would cover Martha's medical expenses while maintaining the fiction that this was simply employment rather than charity. February brought record snowfall to Boston, blanketing the city in white. Richard found himself looking forward to Lily's visits, scheduling his late afternoon meetings in the lobby conference room where he could observe her careful attention to each plant. She spoke to them as she worked, whispering encouragements that made Richard smile despite himself. One particularly brutal Thursday, when winds howled around the tower and temperatures plunged below zero, Richard was surprised to see Lily arrive for her usual shift, her cheeks red from the cold. "You didn't have to come in this weather," he said, meeting her in the lobby. Lily unwound her scarf, a newly knitted one Richard hadn't seen before. "I made a commitment," she replied simply. "Besides, the spider plants on 14 get droopy if they go too long without attention." "How is your grandmother?" Richard asked, falling into step beside her as she headed for the service elevator with her small watering can. "Better," Lily said, her face brightening. "Dr. Stevenson adjusted her medication last week, and she has more energy now. She's even started teaching me to knit." She gestured to her scarf proudly. As February melted into March, a subtle transformation began to occur within the Harrison Tower. Employees who had always been formal and reserved around their intimidating CEO started to soften in Lily's presence. The security guards saved cookies from their lunch bags for her. Jennifer, Richard's typically serious assistant, began bringing in cuttings from her own houseplants for Lily to nurture. Richard observed these changes with fascination. His corporate environment had always reflected his own personality, efficient, formal, somewhat cold. Yet Lily moved through it like a warm current, changing the atmosphere without any conscious effort. More surprising was the change in his own routine. He found himself leaving his office to check on operations during Lily's visits, engaging her in conversations about school, her grandmother's progress, and her observations about the world. Her perspective, unclouded by cynicism or ambition, offered a refreshing contrast to the strategic calculations that dominated his professional interactions. "Why do you work so much?" Lily asked him one rainy afternoon in late March, as she carefully trimmed a pothos plant in his office. Richard looked up from his laptop, surprised by the direct question. "It's what I've always done," he answered after a moment's consideration. "Built this company from nothing. It requires constant attention." Lily nodded thoughtfully. "Grandma says work gives structure to life, but it shouldn't be the structure of life." "Your grandmother has considerable wisdom," Richard acknowledged. "She says you should come for Sunday dinner this weekend," Lily continued, moving to water the peace lily by his window. "She's feeling well enough to cook again, and she makes the best pot roast in Boston." Richard found himself agreeing before he had time to consider how unusual it was for him to accept a social invitation. Sunday dinners were typically spent reviewing quarterly projections or catching up on industry reports. Yet the prospect of a home-cooked meal in the Bennett cottage appealed to him in a way that surprised him. What Richard didn't realize was how significantly this simple dinner invitation would alter the trajectory of lives beyond his own. bringing him into contact with people from his past and catalyzing changes he could never have anticipated when he first heard a child's prayer carried on the winter wind. Sunday arrived with unexpected nervousness for Richard. He stood in his walk-in closet, surveying rows of immaculate suits and designer casual wear, suddenly uncertain what to wear to a family dinner in a church caretaker's cottage. After several minutes of deliberation, he selected dark jeans and a cashmere sweater, the most casual outfit he'd worn in public in years. He debated bringing wine before remembering Martha's heart condition and medications. Instead, he stopped at an artisanal bakery in Beacon Hill, selecting an assortment of pastries for dessert. As an afterthought, he added a small potted orchid, recalling Lily's affinity for plants. St. Mary's bells were ringing for evening service as Richard parked his Audi, having opted to drive himself rather than use his car service beside the church. Parishioners in their Sunday best streamed toward the Gothic entrance, some glancing curiously at the well-known businessman heading not toward the church, but to the small cottage behind it. The door opened before he could knock, Lily's face alight with excitement. "You came. Grandma wasn't sure you would." "I said I would," Richard replied, slightly puzzled. In his business world, commitments were ironclad. Did people commonly accept invitations they didn't intend to honor? The cottage looked different in daylight, smaller perhaps, but warmer somehow. Martha stood at a tiny stove stirring something that filled the room with a savory aroma that instantly transported Richard to childhood memories he rarely accessed. "Richard, welcome," Martha greeted him, wiping her hands on a faded apron. "I hope you like pot roast." "I brought dessert," he said, offering the bakery box. "And this is for your excellent gardener." He handed the orchid to Lily, whose eyes widened with delight. "It's beautiful. I've never had an orchid before." She immediately took it to the windowsill, adjusting its position for optimal light. "Please sit," Martha gestured to the small dining table, already set with mismatched china that Richard suspected held sentimental rather than monetary value. "Dinner's nearly ready." Richard sat, feeling oddly oversized in the modest space. Everything in the cottage spoke of careful economy and thoughtful preservation, the opposite of his world of constant acquisition and replacement. Lily busied herself pouring water into glasses that had once been jelly jars, their original labels long faded. "We're having company for dinner too," she informed Richard. "Father Wilson sometimes joins us on Sundays after early service." Richard felt his shoulders tense involuntarily. The Wilson name still evoked complex emotions, despite the decades that had passed since James Wilson's betrayal. The business partnership that had ended in litigation and permanent distrust had been a formative experience in Richard's early career. Before he could formulate a response, a knock sounded at the door. Lily hurried to answer it, admitting a tall, slender man in clerical attire. Father Thomas Wilson bore a striking resemblance to his brother, the same aquiline nose and thoughtful eyes, though his face carried a gentleness James had lacked. He paused momentarily upon seeing Richard, recognition evident. "Mr. Harrison, what an unexpected pleasure," he said, extending his hand. "Thomas Wilson." Richard rose, accepting the handshake with professional courtesy. "Father Wilson, thank you for your hospitality toward the Bennets." "Not at all," the priest replied. "Martha and Lily enrich our church community immeasurably. We're the fortunate ones." The initial awkwardness gradually dissolved as Martha served dinner. The pot roast was indeed exceptional, tender and flavorful in a way that put Richard's regular restaurant meals to shame. Conversation flowed more easily than Richard had anticipated, centered mostly around Lily's school achievements and community happenings. "Lily tells me you've arranged for her to help with the plants at your office building," Father Wilson commented as they enjoyed coffee after the meal. "That's very kind." "It's mutually beneficial," Richard replied carefully. "She has quite a talent for horticulture." Father Wilson's eyes, observant as a priest's often are, held understanding beyond Richard's diplomatic answer. "Indeed, Martha has always emphasized the dignity of work over charity, a philosophy I've found admirable." "It's simply common sense," Martha interjected, passing the plate of bakery pastries. "A person needs purpose as much as they need help." The conversation shifted to Boston's changing landscape, with Richard providing insights into development plans that would affect the neighborhood. He found himself genuinely engaged, offering information that would normally be reserved for investors or city officials. As the evening progressed, Lily's eyes began to droop despite her obvious efforts to stay awake for the adult conversation. Martha noticed immediately. "Time for bed, little one. School tomorrow." "But we have a guest," Lily protested weakly, though a yawn undermined her argument. "I should be going as well," Richard said, checking his watch with surprise. It was nearly 9 o'clock. The evening had passed more quickly than he'd realized. Lily reluctantly said her goodnights, giving Martha a kiss on the cheek and, to Richard's surprise, offering him a quick, shy hug before disappearing into the cottage's small second bedroom. "I'll help with these dishes before I go," Father Wilson offered, gathering plates from the table. "Nonsense," Martha replied firmly. "You have late services to prepare for. These can wait until morning." After the priest departed with warm goodbyes, Richard found himself alone with Martha, helping, despite her protests, to clear the remaining dishes. "Thank you for dinner," he said, carefully stacking delicate plates beside the tiny sink. "It's been a long time since I experienced a home-cooked meal like this." Martha studied him with perceptive eyes. "You've built an impressive empire, Richard, but I wonder if you've allowed yourself enough life within it." The observation, delivered without judgment, pierced through Richard's usual defenses. "The company has been my focus," he answered simply. "Companies are meant to serve life, not replace it," Martha replied gently. She reached into a drawer and removed a small wooden box, opening it to reveal a collection of mementos. "I've kept this all these years." She handed him a yellowed card, a simple thank you note he'd written her at the end of her second summer working for him. Attached was a small photograph of the two of them standing proudly in front of his first real office space. Richard looked impossibly young, his expression serious but hopeful. Martha stood beside him, her smile encouraging. "You wrote that you were grateful for my belief in your vision when so many others doubted," Martha said softly. "That meant something to me, that a simple secretary's opinion mattered to someone building what would become an empire." Richard felt something shift in his chest as he looked at the photograph. He remembered writing that note, one of countless professional courtesies he'd extended over the years. Yet Martha had kept it for 3 decades, this small gesture preserved among what were clearly her most treasured possessions. "I meant it," he said finally. "Your confidence came at a time when I had precious little of my own." Martha smiled, returning the box to its drawer. "We never know which small kindnesses will echo through someone else's life, do we?" As Richard drove home through Boston's quiet Sunday streets, Martha's words lingered in his mind. His penthouse apartment, when he arrived, seemed cavernous and strangely empty, despite its perfect design and expensive furnishings. He moved through the space with new awareness, noting the absence of personal photographs, the pristine surfaces unmarked by daily living, the silence unbroken by any voice but his own. The following week brought unseasonably warm weather to Boston, coaxing spring flowers from the ground and residents from their winter isolation. Richard found himself increasingly distracted during meetings, his thoughts drifting to the Bennett cottage and its inhabitants. The quarterly projections that had always commanded his full attention now competed with concerns about Martha's health and Lily's future. On Wednesday afternoon, Richard was reviewing acquisition proposals when Jennifer interrupted with uncharacteristic urgency. "Mr. Harrison, there's a call for you on line 1. It's Lily Bennett." Richard felt a surge of concern as he reached for the phone. Lily had never called his office before. "Lily? Is everything all right?" "Richard?" Her voice sounded small and frightened. "Grandma's in the hospital. She collapsed this morning after I left for school. Father Wilson called me out of class." Richard was already reaching for his coat. "Which hospital?" "Boston Memorial. They said something about her heart rhythm being wrong." "I'm on my way," Richard replied, heading for the door. "Are you alone?" "No. Father Wilson is with me." "But Richard," her voice caught. "I'm scared. I'll be there in 15 minutes, he promised. The drive to Boston Memorial was a blur, traffic laws observed only nominally. Richard found himself gripping the steering wheel with unusual force, his typical composure fractured by concern for Martha and the tremor he'd heard in Lily's voice. The hospital's cardiac wing was a maze of corridors and waiting rooms, but Richard navigated it with the confidence of a major donor. He found Lily and Father Wilson in a small waiting area, the girl's face pale with worry, her school uniform rumpled from what had clearly been a rushed departure from class. "Richard!" She jumped up when she saw him, relief evident in her expression. "Any news?" he asked, addressing both Lily and the priest. Father Wilson shook his head. "They're running tests. The doctor mentioned possible atrial fibrillation, but we're waiting for confirmation." Richard nodded, familiar with the condition from his research into Martha's health. "I know Dr. Stevenson is overseeing her care. He's the best in New England." He turned to Lily, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Your grandmother is getting excellent treatment." Lily nodded, but her lower lip trembled. "What if she doesn't—" "She will," Richard interrupted firmly, unwilling to let her complete the thought. "Martha Bennett is one of the strongest people I've ever met." The hours that followed were a strange inversion of Richard's normal routine. Instead of directing meetings and making decisions that affected millions of dollars, he found himself getting coffee from vending machines, thumbing through outdated magazines, and playing simple word games with Lily to distract her from the waiting. Father Wilson observed their interaction with quiet interest. "You're good with her," he commented during a moment when Lily had gone to the restroom. "Not everyone knows how to speak to children during difficult times." Richard hadn't considered his approach. He'd simply spoken to Lily as he would to any intelligent person in distress. "She deserves honesty and distraction in equal measure," he replied. "Most children do." The priest nodded thoughtfully. "My brother mentioned you once, years ago. He said you were brilliant but difficult, uncompromising in business." Richard tensed slightly. "Your brother and I had different approaches to partnership." "Yes, I gathered that," Father Wilson said mildly. "James always valued expediency over principle. It was a source of conflict between us as well." Before Richard could respond, Dr. Stevenson appeared in the waiting room doorway, his expression serious but not grave. "Mr. Harrison." He nodded in greeting, then turned to include Father Wilson and Lily, who had just returned. "Mrs. Bennett is stabilized. The arrhythmia was significant, but we've managed to correct her heart rhythm with medication." "Can we see her?" Lily asked immediately. "Briefly," the doctor replied. "She needs rest, but a short visit would be fine." As they followed Dr. Stevenson down the corridor, the doctor fell into step beside Richard. "This was a warning event," he said quietly. "Her cardiomyopathy is progressing. She'll need more advanced treatment moving forward, possibly including a specialized pacemaker." Richard nodded, making mental notes. "Whatever she needs, doctor." "Cost is not a concern." Martha looked smaller somehow against the hospital sheets, monitoring equipment beeping steadily beside her. Her face brightened when she saw Lily, though fatigue was evident in her expression. "There's my brave girl," she said, extending her hand. "I'm sorry for giving you such a fright." Lily rushed to her side, careful of the IV tubes. "Are you okay, Grandma?" "Just a little hiccup, dear," Martha assured her, though her gaze met Richard's over Lily's head with clear understanding of the situation's seriousness. The visit was necessarily brief, Martha's energy visibly waning despite her attempts to appear strong for Lily's benefit. As they prepared to leave, she beckoned Richard closer. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, "for being there for her." "Of course," Richard replied, surprised she would think he'd do otherwise. Martha's eyes held his with unexpected intensity. "Richard, if anything should happen to me—" "You're getting the best care," he interrupted. "Dr. Stevenson is—" "Even so," Martha continued firmly, "Lily's father is unreachable right now. The mission clinic where he's working has been cut off by seasonal flooding. If decisions need to be made—" She hesitated, then continued with resolution. "I'd trust your judgment, Richard. I've updated my paperwork to reflect that." The weight of her words settled around Richard's shoulders like an unfamiliar mantle. This woman he had reconnected with only months ago was entrusting him with decisions regarding her health care, and potentially, though unspoken, regarding her granddaughter's welfare. "I'll do whatever is needed," he promised, the words emerging with a certainty that surprised him. As they left the hospital, the spring evening settling around them, Richard felt a small hand slip into his. Lily walked beside him silently, her usual energy subdued by worry and exhaustion. "She'll be okay," Richard said, hoping he sounded more confident than he felt. Lily nodded, her face serious in the fading light. "I know, but thank you for being here anyway." In that moment, Richard Harrison, whose name appeared on buildings throughout Boston and whose decisions affected thousands of employees, realized that his presence in this hospital parking lot might be the most consequential act of his recent years. The understanding humbled him in a way business success never had. The following weeks brought significant changes to Richard's carefully structured life. With Martha hospitalized for observation and further testing, the routine he had maintained for decades shifted to accommodate new responsibilities. Board meetings were rescheduled around hospital visits. Conference calls took place from his car in the hospital parking lot. Dinner, once a solitary affair at upscale restaurants or delivered to his penthouse, now often meant sharing takeout with Lily in Martha's hospital room. Father Wilson had arranged for Lily to stay at the cottage, with elderly parishioners taking turns checking on her. But Richard found himself increasingly involved in ensuring her daily life continued with as much normalcy as possible. "You don't have to drive me to school again tomorrow," Lily insisted one evening in late April as Richard walked her to the cottage door. "Mrs. Abernathy said she could take me." "Mrs. Abernathy is 82 and squints through her glasses," Richard replied. "I'd prefer to know you arrived safely." Lily gave him a knowing look that seemed far older than her 10 years. "You're becoming overprotective, you know." The observation startled a laugh from Richard. "Perhaps I am. Is that terrible?" "No," Lily said thoughtfully. "It's nice. Different, but nice." Inside Harrison Tower, subtle changes were occurring as well. Employees who had always viewed their CEO with a mixture of respect and apprehension began to see a different side of him. The sight of Richard Harrison holding a child's backpack while discussing quarterly projections or rearranging his schedule to attend a school science fair humanized him in ways that years of company picnics and holiday parties had failed to accomplish. Jennifer, who had served as his executive assistant for 8 years, observed these changes with quiet interest. One morning in early May, she placed his usual black coffee on his desk and hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Harrison, the executive team has been talking." Richard looked up from his laptop. "About?" "About Lily Bennett." Jennifer paused. "Several of them have children at St. Mary's Elementary. They know about her situation with her grandmother." Richard tensed slightly. "And?" "They've started a support fund," Jennifer continued. "Meals, transportation assistance, school supplies. Nothing intrusive, just help." "I wasn't aware," Richard said, surprised that such an initiative had developed without his knowledge. "It wasn't an official company action," Jennifer explained, "just people who wanted to help. Mark from legal has a daughter in Lily's class. Sarah from marketing volunteers at St. Mary's. They organized it quietly." Richard sat back processing this information. The employees he had always viewed primarily as professional assets were showing dimensions he had never considered. "Why wasn't I informed?" Jennifer hesitated again. "They weren't sure how you'd react. Your relationship with Lily seemed personal. They didn't want to overstep." The idea that his employees might perceive him as territorial about helping a child in need was uncomfortable. Had he really cultivated such an unapproachable persona? "I appreciate you telling me, Jennifer. Please let the team know their initiative is commendable." Later that day, Richard visited Boston Memorial for his daily check-in with Martha. Her condition had stabilized, though the underlying cardiomyopathy remained serious. The specialized pacemaker Dr. Stevenson had mentioned was now being discussed as a necessary intervention. "The procedure has excellent outcomes," Dr. Stevenson explained during their consultation, "but recovery requires significant support. Mrs. Bennett would need assistance with daily activities for several weeks." "I understand," Richard nodded. "Whatever is necessary." "The challenge," the doctor continued carefully, "is that insurance typically only covers minimal home health care. Given Mrs. Bennett's living situation and her granddaughter's age, cost is not an issue," Richard stated firmly. "The Harrison Foundation will cover any expenses insurance doesn't." Martha, who had been listening silently, spoke up. "Richard, while I appreciate your generosity, I've always paid my own way." "Consider it a loan then," Richard countered, their familiar debate resuming. "To be repaid when you're able." Martha's eyes, still sharp despite her physical frailty, studied him with knowing amusement. "We both know that's a fiction, kind as it may be." "Then propose an alternative," Richard challenged, respecting her dignity too much to force his assistance upon her. After a thoughtful pause, Martha spoke. "Lily mentioned you own a summer property on Cape Cod that sits empty most of the year." Richard nodded, curious where this was leading. "A beach house in Chatham. I purchased it as an investment property years ago." "Perhaps," Martha suggested, You could use some assistance managing its maintenance and preparation for eventual rental or sale, someone to oversee cleaning, gardening, general upkeep while you decide its future. Richard understood immediately. That would certainly require an experienced property manager, someone I could trust to maintain appropriate standards. I managed rental properties for the school board after retirement, Martha reminded him, before my health declined. It was an elegant solution, providing Martha with meaningful work that could reasonably compensate for her medical expenses while accommodating her recovery needs. The Cape Cod house, which Richard had indeed neglected for years, would actually benefit from proper oversight. The timing works well, Richard agreed, maintaining the pretense that this was purely a business arrangement. The property should be evaluated before summer. There's a caretaker's apartment above the garage that would provide appropriate accommodation for a property manager and family member, should they wish to stay on site occasionally. Dr. Stevenson, who had observed this exchange with professional discretion, nodded approvingly. The sea air would be beneficial for recovery, Mrs. Bennett, and the reduced stress of a quieter environment would support your heart health, and so another arrangement was made, threading the delicate line between assistance and independence that Martha Bennett insisted upon maintaining. Richard left the hospital that day with a new sense of purpose, already mentally preparing the Chatham property for its new caretakers. The procedure to implant Martha's pacemaker was scheduled for mid-May. As the date approached, Richard found himself increasingly concerned about Lily, who maintained brave composure during hospital visits, but whose worried eyes followed every movement of the medical staff. The evening before the procedure, Richard arrived at the cottage to find Lily sitting on the front step, hugging her knees to her chest. "May I join you?" he asked, settling beside her without waiting for an answer. Lily nodded, her usual chatter absent. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching as the church's stained glass windows glowed with the light of evening services. "What if something goes wrong tomorrow?" Lily finally asked, her voice small. Richard considered his response carefully. In business, he prided himself on unflinching honesty, even when delivering difficult news. But this was different. This was a child's fear for her only family. "Your grandmother is receiving the best possible care," he said finally. "Dr. Stevenson has performed this procedure hundreds of times with excellent results. But there's still a risk," Lily persisted, showing the same insistence on truth that Richard recognized in himself. "Yes," he acknowledged, "there's always some risk. But the greater risk would be not doing the procedure." Lily absorbed this, then asked the question Richard sensed had been weighing on her. "If something happens to Grandma, what happens to me?" The directness of the question struck Richard like a physical blow. "Your grandmother is going to be fine," he said automatically, then paused, recognizing the evasion. Lily deserved better. "But if you're asking about contingencies, your father would be contacted. Dad's clinic doesn't have reliable phones," Lily pointed out. "Sometimes we don't hear from him for months, and when we do, the connection is terrible." Richard nodded, aware of this ongoing challenge. "In the interim, there are procedures. Father Wilson and the church community would ensure you were cared for. Would I have to go to foster care?" The question was asked with such quiet dread that Richard felt something twist in his chest. "No," he said firmly, making a decision in that moment that surprised even himself. "If that situation arose, which it won't, you would stay with me until your father returned." Lily looked up at him, searching his face for certainty. "Really? Really?" Richard confirmed, realizing as he spoke that he meant it completely. "You'd have to learn to cook," Lily said after a moment, a hint of her usual humor returning. "You can't live on restaurant food forever." Richard smiled, relieved to see her spirits lifting. "I'm told I make excellent reservations." The night passed anxiously for both of them. Richard, unused to the cottage's simple accommodations, spent the night on the small sofa rather than returning to his penthouse, wanting to ensure Lily wasn't alone before the early morning hospital check-in. Dawn found them both at Boston Memorial, Lily clutching the small wooden cross Richard had first seen her holding in Franklin Square months earlier. Martha, prepped for surgery, maintained a calm demeanor that seemed to steady everyone around her. "Now you two," she addressed Richard and Lily with gentle authority, "there's no sense in worrying yourselves sick while I'm in there. Richard, why don't you take Lily to that science museum she's always talking about? The procedure will take hours, and sitting in the waiting room won't make it go any faster. Richard recognized the wisdom in the suggestion. Distraction would be better for Lily than watching the clock in the sterile hospital environment. "Only if Lily agrees," he said, deferring to the girl's wishes. Lily looked torn, clearly reluctant to leave the hospital, but also drawn by the possibility of visiting the museum she'd mentioned frequently in their conversations. "The doctors will call us immediately if needed," Richard assured her, "and we can be back here within 20 minutes. After kissing her grandmother goodbye, Lily finally agreed to the excursion. The Boston Museum of Science proved to be an inspired choice, its interactive exhibits providing enough engagement to temporarily distract from hospital concerns. Richard found himself genuinely interested in the exhibits, as seen through Lily's enthusiastic perspective. "Did you know," she informed him, as they explored the electricity demonstration, "that lightning is actually from the ground up, not the sky down? The visible part goes upward, but it's triggered by a downward path we can't see." "I didn't know that," Richard admitted, finding her excitement contagious. "Grandma got me a book about weather phenomena last Christmas," Lily explained. "I've read it 14 times. As they moved through the museum, Richard observed how other visitors interacted with their children, the casual, physical affection, the patient answers to endless questions, the shared delight in discovery. These ordinary family dynamics, which he had never particularly noticed before, now seemed significant in ways he couldn't quite articulate. In the planetarium, as artificial stars wheeled overhead, Lily's small hand found his in the darkness. The simple gesture of trust affected Richard more deeply than any business achievement had in years. When Dr. Stevenson finally called, the news was good. Martha had come through the procedure successfully and was in recovery. The relief that flooded through Richard was profound, surprising him with its intensity. He had known Martha Bennett for mere months in the present, had employed her briefly decades ago, yet her welfare had somehow become deeply important to him. The weeks that followed brought another transition as Martha was discharged to begin her recovery. The Chatham House was prepared with necessary medical accommodations, its neglected gardens brought back to life by a professional landscaping crew working under Lily's earnest supervision. Memorial Day weekend marked their official relocation to Cape Cod. Richard found himself making the 90-minute drive from Boston with increasing frequency, often staying in the main house over weekends, while Martha and Lily settled into the garage apartment, an arrangement that maintained everyone's independence while ensuring support was readily available. The beachfront property, which Richard had purchased purely as a financial investment, gradually transformed from a sterile showcase into something resembling a home. Martha's touch brought warmth to the apartment through simple additions, handmade quilts, cherished books, family photographs. Lily's influence spread to the main house as well, with seashell collections appearing on windowsills and childish but earnest watercolors of the ocean view finding their way onto previously bare walls. June brought warming temperatures and Martha's steady improvement. Richard, who had initially planned to limit his Cape Cod visits to weekends, found increasingly creative reasons to extend his stays. Board meetings could be conducted remotely. Market analyses could be reviewed from the deck overlooking the Atlantic. The penthouse in Boston, once his sanctuary, now felt strangely empty compared to the sound of Lily's footsteps running across the beach, or Martha's quiet humming as she tended the herb garden she had started beside the kitchen door. One evening in late June, Richard sat on the deck watching the sunset, his laptop open but forgotten beside him. Martha joined him, moving more steadily now with her recovery progressing well. "You seem pensive," she observed, settling into the adjacent chair. Richard nodded, struggling to articulate the thoughts that had been occupying him with increasing frequency. "I've been considering some restructuring." "Of the company?" Martha asked, though her tone suggested she understood he meant something more personal. "Of priorities," Richard clarified. "I've spent 30 years building Harrison Group with a single-minded focus. It's been effective, professionally. But," Martha prompted gently. "But I'm beginning to question the cost," Richard admitted. "The company has consumed everything. Time, relationships, personal development. There's been no room for anything else." Martha was quiet for a moment, watching the golden light play across the waves. "It's never too late to create that room, Richard. Even at 58. Especially at 58, Martha replied with a smile. "You have resources, wisdom, and hopefully decades ahead. The question is what you want to fill them with." As the sky deepened from gold to purple, their conversation turned to practical matters. Martha's follow-up appointments, Lily's summer reading program, the property improvements Richard was considering for the Chatham house. Yet the underlying question remained, hovering in Richard's mind as he returned to Boston the following day. What did he want to fill his life with, beyond the next acquisition or development project? For the first time in decades, Richard Harrison found himself contemplating a future defined by more than business success, a future that somehow included a spirited 10-year-old girl and her wise grandmother in ways he could never have anticipated on that December evening when a child's prayer had drifted up to his office window. July in Chatham brought perfect New England summer days, azure skies, gentle breezes, carrying the scent of salt water and beach roses, and tourists flooding the Cape's picturesque towns. For Richard, whose summer routine had previously consisted of working through vacation season, while others enjoyed leisure time, the rhythm of beach life required adjustment. His typical tailored suits gave way to casual wear. Conference calls were sometimes conducted with bare feet, buried in warm sand. The strict schedule that had governed his life for decades relaxed to accommodate tide tables and Lily's enthusiastic plans for beach explorations. Martha's recovery progressed steadily, her strength returning as she embraced her role managing the property. The garage apartment had been transformed with her careful touch into a cozy home, while the main house began to reflect the influence of its increasing occupants. Richard found himself spending 4 or 5 nights a week in Chatham, returning to Boston only when physically required for meetings. "Your team thinks you've been body-snatched," Jennifer informed him during one of his brief appearances at Harrison Tower in mid-July. "Mr. Livingston from the board asked if you were having a health crisis." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Because I'm taking a partial summer break for the first time in 30 years. Because you smiled at the maintenance staff this morning," Jennifer countered, the corner of her mouth twitching upward. "And you have sand in your shoes." Richard glanced down, noticing the fine grains of Cape Cod beach clinging to his Italian leather loafers. A year ago, such an imperfection in his presentation would have been unthinkable. Now it seemed a trivial matter compared to the shell-collecting expedition he had promised Lily that afternoon. The transformation wasn't limited to Richard's personal habits. Professional decisions that once would have been made purely on profit potential now underwent more nuanced evaluation. When a lucrative development opportunity arose that would have displaced a historic neighborhood community center, Richard surprised his executive team by declining the project and instead directing resources toward renovating the existing structure. "It's not just about what we build," he explained to his bewildered board of directors. "It's about what we preserve in the process." The summer brought visitors to the Chatham house, Martha's former colleagues, church friends from St. Mary's, and increasingly, Richard's employees and business associates. What began as official meetings relocated to a more pleasant setting evolved into genuine social gatherings, with Lily serving as an enthusiastic tour guide to the Cape's attractions. On a particularly beautiful Saturday in late July, Richard hosted an informal company picnic on the beach property. Families of Harrison Group employees spread blankets on the sand. Children splashed in the gentle waves, and for the first time in the company's history, the CEO himself manned the grill, following Martha's careful instructions on burger flipping technique. "So I've got quite a knack for this," observed Mark Sullivan from Legal Affairs, watching Richard arrange perfectly grilled hot dogs on a platter. "Hidden talents, Mr. Harrison." "Martha's an excellent teacher," Richard replied, nodding toward where she sat beneath a beach umbrella, surrounded by admiring employees. "She's remarkable," Mark agreed. "My daughter Amy is in Lily's class. She says Mrs. Bennett was the best substitute teacher they had all year, even teaching from her wheelchair after the surgery." Richard hadn't known Martha had returned to occasional teaching. The discovery of this detail, one of many he was continually learning about the Bennetts, reinforced his growing awareness of how rich their lives were despite material limitations. As the afternoon progressed, Richard found himself in conversation with Sarah Chen, his marketing director, while watching Lily organize a group of children in an elaborate sandcastle competition. "She's an extraordinary child," Sarah commented, following his gaze. "The way she includes everyone makes sure the younger kids have important jobs too." Richard nodded, a strange pride warming his chest. She has her grandmother's gift for bringing out the best in people. And her influence is contagious, Sarah added, with a knowing smile. The most cutthroat CEO in New England real estate is now known for asking about employees' families and grilling hot dogs at company picnics. Richard's initial instinct to bristle at the characterization faded as he recognized the truth in her words. People can change, Ms. Chen. Yes, she agreed, but they rarely do without good reason. The conversation lingered in Richard's thoughts as July melted into August. The reason for his changes was becoming increasingly clear, though he had yet to fully articulate it even to himself. The Bennetts had awakened something long dormant, a capacity for connection, for finding meaning beyond achievement and acquisition. One muggy August morning, Richard was reviewing property reports in the Chatham House study when the landline rang, a rarely used number primarily maintained for emergencies. He answered to find Jennifer's voice, unusually tense. "Mr. Harrison, I've been trying your cell. There's an international call that came through the office for Lily Bennett, from Guatemala." Richard felt a jolt of alertness. "Her father?" "Yes, sir, Dr. Michael Bennett. The connection isn't great, but he's asking urgently for his daughter or mother. I told him I'd locate you immediately." "Put him through to this line," Richard directed, already moving toward the door to find Lily, who was helping Martha in the garden. The call transferred with a series of clicks and static. "Hello, this is Richard Harrison. Dr. Bennett here." The voice was faint and breaking up, but the tension in it was clear. "Who am I speaking with?" "Richard Harrison. I'm a friend of your mother and daughter." Friend seemed inadequate for what the Bennetts had become to him, but there was no time for explanations. "Mr. Harrison, I'm trying to reach my family. I've had no contact for months due to the flooding and infrastructure damage here. Is my mother all right? And Lily?" "They're both well," Richard assured him quickly. "Your mother had a cardiac procedure in May, a pacemaker implantation. She's recovering excellently. Lily is fine, thriving in fact." Relief was audible even through the poor connection. "Thank God. The last communication I received mentioned Mother's declining health, and I've been desperately trying to get information. The clinic where I'm working was cut off by landslides for weeks. Dr. Bennett, your family is currently staying at my property in Chatham. Your mother is managing the estate, and Lily is enjoying the summer break. I'd be happy to have them come to the phone." "Please," Michael Bennett replied, his voice steadying. "And Mr. Harrison, thank you for looking after them." Richard fetched Lily from the garden, explaining that her father was on the phone. Her face lit up with a joy that pierced straight through Richard's heart, a mixture of delight and a strange, unexpected pang he couldn't immediately identify. As Lily rushed to take the call, Martha looked up from her gardening, understanding in her eyes. Michael finally got through. Richard nodded, helping her to her feet. "The connection isn't great, but he sounds well. Concerned about you both, of course." Martha squeezed his arm gently. "This call will mean everything to Lily. She tries to be strong, but she misses her father terribly." They moved inside to find Lily, animatedly describing her summer adventures, the phone clutched tightly to her ear. "And the whales came so close to the boat, Dad. Richard hired a special tour just for us, and the guide said it was the best orca sighting of the season." Richard and Martha waited discreetly, allowing Lily her private conversation. When she finally handed the phone to her grandmother, her eyes were bright with excitement. "Dad's coming home," she announced to Richard, bouncing on her toes. "His mission is ending, and he's being transferred back to the States permanently." Richard manufactured an appropriately enthusiastic response, even as he processed the implications. Of course, Michael Bennett would eventually return. That had always been the understanding. Yet somehow, in the domestic rhythm that had developed over the summer, Richard had pushed this inevitability to the periphery of his thoughts. Martha's conversation with her son was briefer, focused on practical matters of health and logistics. When she hung up, her expression was a mixture of joy and thoughtful consideration. "Michael hopes to be back by early October," she informed them. "The clinic is transitioning to local medical staff and he's completed his contract. He's been offered a position at Boston Memorial, working with their international medicine program." "That's wonderful news," Richard said, meaning it despite the complicated emotions churning beneath his composed exterior. "Dr. Stevenson speaks highly of that department." "Yes, it will be good to have him home," Martha agreed, her perceptive eyes studying Richard. "Of course, this will mean changes for our current arrangement." Before the conversation could continue, Lily tugged at Richard's hand. "Can we call Jennifer and ask her to help Dad find an apartment near us? He said he wants to be close to Boston Memorial, but also near us." "Of course," Richard agreed automatically, "though perhaps we should discuss options with your father directly when he returns." The remainder of August passed in a blur of summer activities, now tinged with anticipation of Michael Bennett's return. Lily spoke of little else, eager to share her experiences and introduce her father to the people who had become important in his absence. Richard found himself increasingly reflective, aware that the unconventional family dynamic that had developed over the past months would necessarily shift with Michael's arrival. While he genuinely looked forward to meeting the man whose absence had indirectly led to such significant changes in his own life, he also recognized that his role would inevitably be redefined. Labor Day weekend marked the traditional end of Cape Cod's high season. As tourists began their exodus and children prepared to return to school, Richard arranged a special dinner at the Chatham House. Martha insisted on cooking despite his offers to cater, creating her signature pot roast and apple pie in the main house's kitchen. As they enjoyed the meal on the deck overlooking the darkening ocean, Lily regaled them with plans for the upcoming school year. "Miss Peterson says if I maintain my grades, I could apply for the advanced science program in spring. They do special field trips to the MIT laboratories. That sounds perfect for you," Richard encouraged, having witnessed firsthand her aptitude for scientific inquiry. "Though I'll miss my assistant gardener if you're busy with extra classes." "I'll still help on weekends," Lily promised earnestly. "Someone has to make sure you don't overwater the succulents." Martha watched their easy interaction with quiet satisfaction. After dinner, while Lily was inside selecting a board game for their evening entertainment, she broached the subject that had been hovering unspoken. "Richard, I want to thank you for everything these past months. You've given us so much more than material support. You've given me far more," Richard replied honestly. "This has been transformative." Martha nodded, understanding the depth behind his simple statement. "When Michael returns, things will change. That's inevitable. But I want you to know that you've become family to us, Richard. That doesn't end because circumstances shift. Family." The word resonated through Richard with unexpected power. He had been without family for so long that he had almost forgotten what it meant to be claimed as part of one. "I'd like to propose something," he said carefully. "The Boston apartment where you and Lily lived before, it's owned by the church, correct?" "Yes, the caretaker's cottage. Father Wilson has been holding it for us, though he's had inquiries from potential tenants. The Harrison Foundation has been developing a medical housing initiative," Richard explained, "providing accommodations for doctors working in community service positions at reduced rates. The program needs a pilot location." Martha's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the direction of his thoughts. "Richard, it would be a legitimate business arrangement," he continued. "The foundation would lease the entire church property at market value, then sublease the cottage to qualified medical personnel, such as a doctor working with Boston Memorial's International Medicine program." "And what would the church do with this windfall?" Martha asked, her tone both skeptical and amused. "Expand its community outreach, perhaps. I understand their youth education program could use additional resources." Richard maintained a straight face, despite knowing Martha saw through his careful construction. "You're becoming quite creative with these arrangements," she observed. "I've had excellent teachers in negotiation recently," he replied, thinking of the many compromises they had crafted to balance assistance with independence. Their conversation was interrupted by Lily's return, board game in hand. The evening passed in comfortable companionship, the rhythm of their interaction now familiar and precious to Richard, in ways he would never have anticipated when he first heard a child's prayer carried on the winter wind. September brought cooler temperatures and preparations for the school year. Richard found himself involved in details he would once have considered trivial: shopping for school supplies, arranging transportation from Chatham to St. Mary's, coordinating with teachers about Lily's advanced placement possibilities. As the Bennetts' planned return to Boston approached, Richard made his own preparations. The caretaker's cottage behind St. Mary's underwent subtle renovations, improved insulation, updated appliances, a state-of-the-art security system installed with careful discretion. The Harrison Foundation's Medical Housing Initiative became an official program with the church property as its flagship location. Yet beneath these practical arrangements lay deeper considerations. Richard found himself contemplating what role he would maintain in the Bennetts' lives once their regular proximity diminished. The prospect of returning to his former isolation after experiencing the richness of genuine connection seemed increasingly untenable. One evening in late September, as Richard worked in the Chatham House study, Lily appeared in the doorway, her expression uncharacteristically serious. "Can I ask you something important?" she requested, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Of course," Richard replied, closing his laptop to give her his full attention. "When Dad comes home and we move back to Boston." She hesitated, then pressed on. "Will we still see you?" The directness of the question matched the concern that had been circling in Richard's own mind. "I'd like that very much," he answered honestly. "If you and your grandmother and father would want that too. I was worried you might go back to being just a businessman once Grandma was better," Lily admitted. "Sometimes adults help for a while, and then they get busy with their regular lives again." Richard considered his response carefully, recognizing the importance of this conversation. "Lily, meeting you and your grandmother hasn't been a temporary detour from my regular life. It's changed what I want my regular life to be." "Really?" Hope brightened her expression. "Really," Richard confirmed. "Some changes are permanent, even when circumstances shift. The connection we've formed, that's not dependent on where you live or who else is in your life." Lily nodded, processing this. "That's good, because I told Dad all about you and he really wants to meet you. He said anyone who helped take care of his family while he was gone is important to him too." As September waned and October approached, bringing with it Michael Bennett's imminent return, Richard found himself standing at a crossroads he hadn't anticipated a year earlier. The workaholic CEO, whose life had been defined by acquisition and achievement, now found himself valuing relationships and connection in ways that would have seemed foreign to his former self. What had begun with a child's prayer heard by chance had evolved into something profound, a redefinition of success, of family, of purpose. As Richard watched the sunset from the Chatham House deck one evening, Martha's words from months earlier echoed in his mind. "Companies are meant to serve life, not replace it." For the first time in decades, Richard Harrison was building something more valuable than real estate, a life rich with meaning beyond the bottom line, with connections that transcended business transactions. And as he contemplated the changes coming with Michael Bennett's return, he found himself not fearing the adjustment, but curious about the next chapter in this unexpected story. October arrived in New England with a spectacular display of autumn colors. The maple trees lining Boston's historic streets blazed in crimson and gold, mirroring the transformation that had occurred in Richard Harrison's life over the past 10 months. The date of Michael Bennett's return approached with a mixture of anticipation and subtle tension. Lily could speak of little else, her excitement palpable as she counted down the days. Martha maintained her characteristic calm, though her eyes shone with maternal joy at the prospect of reuniting with her son, and Richard found himself experiencing complex emotions he couldn't entirely categorize. Genuine happiness for the Bennetts, tempered with uncertainty about his own place in their reconfigured family dynamic. The Chatham House had been closed for the season, summer furniture stored away, and the Bennetts' belongings moved back to the renovated cottage behind St. Mary's. Richard's penthouse, which had felt increasingly empty during his frequent Cape Cod stays, now seemed particularly sterile upon his full-time return. On a crisp Wednesday morning in early October, Richard sat in his office at Harrison Tower, attempting to focus on quarterly projections while glancing frequently at his phone. Michael Bennett's flight was scheduled to land at Logan International at 11:23 a.m. Martha and Lily had gone to meet him, declining Richard's offer of his car service with the explanation that this first reunion should be private, a sentiment Richard understood completely, even as he found himself strangely restless waiting for news. "Mr. Harrison," Jennifer's voice interrupted his distracted review of spreadsheets. "The executive committee is waiting in the conference room." Richard checked his watch, surprised to discover he was 10 minutes late for his own meeting, an unprecedented occurrence in his precisely scheduled professional life. "Thank you, Jennifer. I'll be right there." The meeting proceeded efficiently, though several board members exchanged glances at their CEO's occasional lapses in attention. When Richard's phone vibrated with a text message, he broke his own strict rule against checking messages during meetings, glancing discreetly at the screen. A photo appeared, Lily beaming between Martha in her wheelchair and a tall man with Lily's same striking blue eyes and a weary but joyful smile. Beneath it, Lily had written, "Dad's home. Can we all have dinner soon?" Something tight in Richard's chest loosened at the message. The family reunion had clearly gone well, and Lily's immediate inclusion of him in future plans suggested his place in their lives remained secure. "Mr. Harrison?" The board chairman's voice pulled him back to the meeting. "Your thoughts on the waterfront proposal?" "I believe we should decline," Richard replied, gathering his professional focus. "The environmental impact concerns outweigh the potential returns, and our reputation for responsible development is more valuable long-term than the immediate profit margin." The statement, prioritizing community impact over maximum financial gain, reflected a philosophical shift that had been gradually permeating Richard's business decisions over recent months. What surprised him was the nodding agreement from several board members, who once would have argued vigorously for pursuing maximum profit, regardless of external factors. After the meeting, Jennifer handed him a stack of messages. "Dr. Bennett called while you were in the conference room," she informed him. "He asked if you might be available for dinner tomorrow evening at 6. He said, and I quote, 'I'd like to thank the man who's been taking care of my family,' and Lily won't stop talking about him." Richard felt an unexpected nervousness at the prospect of meeting Michael Bennett, a man whose absence had inadvertently created the space for Richard's own relationship with the Bennetts to develop. "Please call back and confirm," he instructed Jennifer, "and reschedule my evening appointments tomorrow." The following day passed with unusual slowness, Richard's typically laser focus disrupted by thoughts of the upcoming dinner. At precisely 5:45, he found himself standing outside the caretaker's cottage, a bottle of sparkling cider in one hand and a carefully wrapped package in the other. The door opened before he could knock, revealing Lily's excited face. "Richard, you're exactly on time. Dad said you would be. Punctuality is a virtue," Richard replied with a smile, stepping inside. The cottage felt different with Michael Bennett's presence, more crowded physically, but also more complete in a way that resonated with rightness, despite Richard's complicated emotions. Family photographs that had been carefully packed away during Martha's hospitalization now adorned the small living room, including several showing a younger Michael in remote medical settings, surrounded by children. Michael Bennett stepped forward, extending his hand. He was taller than Richard had expected, with Lily's same direct gaze and an air of calm competence that likely served him well in crisis medical situations. "Mr. Harrison, I can't adequately express my gratitude for everything you've done for my family." "It's Richard, please," he replied, shaking the offered hand. "And the gratitude goes both ways. Your mother and daughter have enriched my life considerably." Martha observed their interaction from her position near the small dining table, which had been set with the mismatched china Richard had come to recognize as the Bennett family's finest. "I see you two will get along just fine," she commented with satisfaction. Dinner was a lively affair, with Michael sharing stories from Guatemala and Lily eagerly updating her father on her academic achievements and summer adventures. Richard found himself relaxing as the meal progressed, surprised by how easily Michael included him in the conversation, referring to shared experiences with Martha and Lily as if Richard's presence in their lives was both natural and welcome. "Lily tells me you've developed quite the green thumb," Michael commented as they enjoyed Martha's apple crisp for dessert. "Apparently my office plants were declared beyond saving and replaced with hardier specimens under her supervision." Richard laughed, recalling Lily's dismay at the neglected philodendron she'd discovered in his office. "Your daughter has strong opinions about proper plant care. I've learned not to argue." "Wise man," Michael nodded with the weary wisdom of a parent. "I'm still catching up on all the changes while I was gone. Lily's advanced science program application, Mother's new cardiac specialist, and of course the Harrison Foundation's medical housing initiative that coincidentally includes this cottage." The slight emphasis on coincidentally was accompanied by a knowing look that confirmed Michael had seen through the careful arrangement Richard had constructed. "The foundation is always looking for worthwhile projects," Richard replied mildly. "Indeed." Michael's expression was thoughtful. "Mother mentioned you might have some insights about another project I'm considering." After dessert, while Lily helped Martha with the dishes, Michael invited Richard to join him on the cottage's small porch. The October evening was cool but pleasant, the church's stained glass windows glowing warmly across the small courtyard. "I want to be direct, Richard," Michael began once they were seated. "I understand that in my absence you've become important to my family. Lily talks about you constantly, and my mother speaks of you with great affection and respect." Richard nodded, uncertain where the conversation was heading. "I also understand," Michael continued, "that your involvement wasn't limited to financial assistance, though that was certainly generous. You've given something more valuable: your time, your presence, your genuine care." "They made it easy," Richard replied honestly. "Your daughter and mother are extraordinary people." Michael smiled. "They are indeed, which is why I want to be clear that I have no intention of disrupting the relationships that have formed. My return doesn't mean you should step back." Relief washed through Richard, though he maintained his composed exterior. "I appreciate that. They've become very important to me." "I can see that," Michael observed, "and it's mutual. Which brings me to something I wanted to discuss with you." He explained that Boston Memorial had offered him a position establishing a new international medicine training program, an opportunity to use his field experience to prepare other physicians for work in underserved regions. The position was ideal professionally, but came with significant startup challenges. "The hospital has allocated space and basic funding," Michael explained, "but creating a truly comprehensive program would require additional resources: training equipment, specialized technology, scholarship funds for promising students from disadvantaged backgrounds." Richard immediately saw the potential. The Harrison Foundation has been looking to expand its healthcare initiatives. "This sounds like an excellent opportunity for partnership." "That's what I hoped you might say," Michael nodded. "But I want to be clear, this isn't about leveraging your relationship with my family. This program has genuine merit and would serve communities far beyond Boston." "I never doubted that," Richard assured him. "Your reputation preceded you at Boston Memorial. Dr. Stevenson speaks very highly of your work." As they discussed the possibilities, Richard felt a growing sense of alignment, not just professionally, but in values and vision. Michael Bennett's dedication to using his medical expertise to serve vulnerable populations resonated with Richard's evolving perspective on the responsibilities that came with wealth and influence. When they rejoined Martha and Lily inside, the conversation shifted to more immediate family matters: Michael's apartment search, Lily's school schedule, the upcoming holiday season. Richard listened, offering occasional input, but primarily observing the Bennett family's natural rhythm, now enhanced rather than disrupted by Michael's return. As the evening drew to a close, Lily presented Richard with a small wrapped package. "We made this for you," she explained, watching eagerly as he carefully removed the paper. Inside was a framed photograph: Richard with Martha and Lily on the Chatham House deck, the summer sunset turning the ocean to gold behind them. Richard remembered the moment, a spontaneous picture taken by Sarah from marketing during the company picnic. In the image, Lily was laughing at something just said, Martha was smiling with serene pleasure, and Richard, to his surprise, looked more relaxed and genuinely happy than he could remember appearing in years. "For your office," Lily explained. "So you don't forget about us when you're being a businessman." "As if that were possible," Richard replied, his voice uncharacteristically soft. The weeks that followed brought a new rhythm to Richard's life, different from both his former isolation and the intensive involvement of the summer months, but satisfying in its balance. Sunday dinners at the Bennett cottage became a regular tradition. Michael found an apartment near Boston Memorial, but joined these weekly gatherings, the four of them forming an unconventional but harmonious family unit. The Harrison Foundation's partnership with Michael's international medicine program developed rapidly, with Richard finding professional satisfaction in applying his business acumen to support meaningful healthcare initiatives. Board members who had initially questioned his shifting priorities now acknowledged the benefits, not just in community goodwill, but in employee engagement and innovative thinking throughout the company. As Thanksgiving approached, Richard found himself reflecting on the extraordinary year that had passed since that rainy December evening when a child's prayer had drifted up to his office window. The transformation in his life was profound, from isolated workaholic to connected community member. from profit-driven CEO to purpose-oriented leader. "You're miles away," Martha observed one Sunday afternoon in mid-November as they sat together while Michael and Lily walked to the corner bakery for dessert. "Something on your mind?" Richard nodded, attempting to articulate thoughts that had been forming for weeks. "I've been considering my legacy," he said finally. "Not just what I leave behind in real estate holdings or corporate achievements, but in impact, in lives touched." Martha's eyes were warm with understanding. "The best legacies aren't built of brick and steel, Richard. They're built of moments, connections, ripples of influence that continue long after we're gone. I've been thinking about expanding the Foundation's educational initiatives," Richard continued, "specifically creating a scholarship program for students interested in both medicine and community service. Students like Lily might one day become." "That sounds like a worthy endeavor," Martha agreed. "Though Lily might surprise us all and become an astronaut or botanical researcher, that child contains multitudes." Richard smiled, acknowledging the truth in her observation. "The point is creating opportunities, whatever direction they might take." When Michael and Lily returned, cheeks flushed from the crisp November air and bearing a bakery box of cinnamon rolls, the conversation turned to Thanksgiving plans. To Richard's surprise, the assumption that he would join the Bennetts for the holiday had already been made. "We always volunteer at the church's community dinner before our own meal," Lily informed him. "You can help Dad carve turkeys." The ease with which he was included in their family traditions still caught Richard off guard sometimes, though he was learning to accept it with increasing naturalness. December arrived with swirling snowflakes and holiday decorations throughout Boston. The anniversary of Richard's first encounter with Lily approached, a year since he had heard her prayer from his office window, a year of profound transformation. On the evening of that anniversary, Richard found himself standing in Franklin Square, watching snowflakes settle on the bench where he had first spoken with Lily. The winter wind was sharp, but he barely noticed, lost in contemplation of how completely his life had changed since that moment. "I thought I might find you here," a voice spoke behind him. Richard turned to find Michael Bennett approaching, bundled against the cold. "Just taking a moment to reflect," Richard explained. "It was exactly here 1 year ago today." Michael nodded, understanding without further explanation. Lily mentioned the significance of the date. She wanted to come herself, but Mother insisted she finish her science project first. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the snow accumulate on the empty park benches. "You know," Michael said finally, "as a doctor, I've witnessed countless moments where lives change direction in an instant, some tragic, some miraculous. But I've rarely seen a chance encounter create such positive ripple effects for so many people." "I was just standing at my window," Richard replied. "Lily was the one with enough faith to pray aloud in an empty park, and enough wisdom to refuse charity but accept connection," Michael added. "She gets that from Mother." As they walked back toward St. Mary's, the church bells began to ring, their clear tones carrying through the winter evening. The stained glass windows glowed with warmth and welcome, a beacon in the gathering darkness. Inside the cottage, they found Martha and Lily had prepared a special dinner to mark the anniversary. The table was set with care, a small centerpiece of evergreen branches and candles creating a festive atmosphere. "We're celebrating Friendship Day," Lily announced as they entered, brushing snowflakes from their coats. "That's what I'm calling it, the day Richard became part of our family." "An excellent name," Martha approved, wheeling herself to the table, "and most appropriate for what we're commemorating." As they settled around the table, Richard looked at the three faces that had become so dear to him: Martha with her wisdom and quiet strength, Michael with his dedicated compassion, and Lily, whose simple prayer had set everything in motion. The transformation in his life was profound, yet it had happened so naturally that he could hardly remember the isolated man he had been a year earlier. "I have something for each of you," Richard said, reaching into his coat pocket, "to mark this occasion." For Martha, a delicate silver bookmark engraved with her favorite Emily Dickinson quote about hope. For Michael, an antique stethoscope Richard had discovered in a specialty auction, once owned by a pioneering doctor who had established field hospitals during the Civil War. And for Lily, a small wooden box containing a silver pendant, a miniature version of the wooden cross she had been holding that first night, now cast in precious metal, but maintaining the simplicity of the original. So you'll always remember that prayers are sometimes answered in unexpected ways, Richard explained, as Lily examined the pendant with wonder. I have something for you too, she replied, disappearing into her room and returning with a carefully wrapped package. Inside, Richard found a handmade album. The first page held a pressed flower from the Franklin Square garden. Subsequent pages documented their year together. Photographs, Lily's drawings, pressed leaves from the Chatham beach, even the receipt from Sullivan's Diner, where they had shared their first meal. So you never forget how it all started, Lily explained, and how far we've come. As they shared the anniversary dinner, conversation flowed easily between reflections on the past year and plans for the future. Michael's expanding medical program, Martha's improving health, Lily's academic achievements, and Richard's evolving vision for his company and foundation. Later that evening, as Richard prepared to leave, Martha beckoned him closer to her chair. Do you remember what I told you months ago? About the fingerprints good people leave on your heart? Richard nodded, recalling the conversation vividly. Look at the fingerprints you've left this year, she said softly, gesturing toward where Lily was animatedly explaining her science project to her father. And the ones they've left on you. That's the true measure of a life well lived, Richard. Not in buildings with your name on them, but in lives that are better because you were part of them. As Richard walked through the gently falling snow toward his car, he glanced up at the Harrison Tower rising above the city skyline, the symbol of his professional success that had once been the primary focus of his existence. It remained impressive, a testament to decades of dedication and strategic vision, but now it was just one element in a life that had expanded to include so much more. 1 year ago, a child's prayer had drifted up 30 floors on the winter wind, reaching a man who had forgotten how to listen to anything but market projections and business strategies. That simple moment of connection had set in motion changes neither could have anticipated, transforming not just 2 lives, but creating ripples that continued to spread outward, touching family, community, and beyond. Richard Harrison, once known only for his business acumen and isolated existence, now moved through the world differently. Connected, engaged, his definition of success fundamentally altered. The empire he had built remained, but its purpose had shifted from being an end in itself to a means of creating positive impact. And as he drove through the snowy Boston streets toward his apartment, Richard realized that the prayer he had overheard a year ago had indeed been answered, not just for a hungry child seeking help, but for a man who had been starving in ways he hadn't even recognized until he learned to nourish his heart as well as his ambition. Femme de Historia. Dear readers, we hope you've been moved by Richard, Lily, and the Bennett family's emotional journey. For more heartwarming stories like this one, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating narratives. Find it by clicking on the link to your left. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give the video a thumbs up. Every day we bring unique stories that explore life's complexity and the power of unexpected connections. Don't miss our upcoming content, and we look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments section below.